For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Tony Giannidis. I'm the director of the Pardee Center and a professor in the Department of Earth and Environment. And so before I introduce our speaker, let me say a little bit about the center. We do this event on an annual basis and invite a distinguished lecturer. And each year what we try to do is invite somebody who really kind of embodies the intent of the center itself. That is, somebody who really seeks to understand in a fundamentally interdisciplinary way all those factors that cause the world to unfold the way it does. Whether this is a matter of environment, political science and politics, economics, or social issues, we strive to reach that kind of, to promote that kind of research and reach that kind of understanding. So we're really defined by a desire to solve problems rather than strictly a desire to make progress in one discipline. So that having been said, let me turn to introducing our speaker, Diana Liverman. Diana is Regents Professor of Geography and Development at the University of Arizona. She has worked for a very long time at the interface of research on vulnerability, adaptation, climate change. She's one of the handful of social geographers who has forged enduring and productive partnerships with scientists in the physical sciences to try to understand all of the elements of how, not only how the physical environment is changing, but why it matters and what we can start to do about it, both in the developing world and here. I won't tell you how long it's been since I first met Diana, because it would be bad manners, and besides, I can't remember. But I'll just say that she was one of the first set of investigators in what was then a really very innovative program at NASA on land cover and land use change, which sought to really try and meld the insights of social scientists, political scientists, the remote sensing community, ecologists, and a whole raft of natural science. And so what she's going to talk about today, if you look at this, what she's going to talk about is a really complex dilemma, the intersections of poverty, gender, ethnicity, and race in climate vulnerability and adaptation. And I'm sure she will explain how that relates to climate vulnerability and update. But I'm going to leave that to Diana. So what we'll do is Diana will talk for about 35, 40 minutes ish. Then she and I will sit up here. We'll start the discussion, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. And then I hope people will stay for the reception afterwards. With that, Diana.
All right. Are we OK on the mic? Yeah. So thank you very much, Tony. And the title changed only because you always get asked for your title quite a long time in advance. And then when you start writing your paper, you realize, well, I think I'm actually going to talk about a couple of other things as well. So I am actually going to talk a lot about intersectionality and race and gender as it relates to vulnerability, but I'm going to talk about a couple other things as well. And it really is an update and a reflection because I've been working on vulnerability initially to drought and then climate change for multiple decades. So it's always interesting to look back where you came from and to think about where you're going or where you want your graduate students to go. I used this photo because for me it epitomizes vulnerability and gender vulnerability to drought. It's a famous photograph from the Depression by Dorothea Lange. So I'm going to reflect on some of these decades of my own work on climate vulnerability and adaptation, look at some of the enduring challenges in researching vulnerability and also implementing adaptation in order to reduce vulnerability. And what I'm going to talk about is partly inspired by my present work, which is actually I'm on my way to Botswana right now for a meeting of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, We're writing a report on whether it's possible to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees C and also meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's sort of like, can we eliminate poverty and prevent climate change at the same time? But I also want to acknowledge my graduate students. I'm teaching a graduate seminar on vulnerability this semester who inspire me, and I'll try to, a lot of the work I'll talk about is being done or has been done by my PhD students. And just to give you a little bit of personal background, I've actually been interested in questions of drought vulnerability really since I was a little kid. Because I was born in Ghana in West Africa. My dad was part of the British mission to build the Volta Dam. And when we moved back to England, we always had an interest in Africa. And unfortunately, when I was younger, it was a period when there were these horrific famines in the Sahel. And the BBC would show these pictures of terribly emaciated children. And I would asked my dad, like, why didn't you build more dams so that these kids wouldn't be starving and so that they could grow more food? And his response was, well, we can't fix that now, but why don't you give some money, some of your pocket money to Oxfam because they help people? And I never thought that years later I would actually spend some time as an advisor to Oxfam on climate change. So I've been interested in it a long time. And my introduction to the ideas of, more scholarly ideas of climate vulnerability was when I was a first-year geography student in London. And I had a couple of amazing professors, including a woman called Anne White, who wrote one of the very first dissertations on climate vulnerability in Oaxaca. And she got me interested in how we could study vulnerability from a scholarly point of view. And that's the sort of beginning of a very long story. So let's start by looking at how one might define vulnerability to climate change. And the point I want to make in this first 5 minutes or so is that I think we've completely overcomplicated how we think about vulnerability and how we measure it. Because for me, it's a very simple definition. I've put it here, the condition of people and places that increases their chances of being harmed by climate or drought. And very simply, there's a multiple set of things that can make you more likely to be harmed than other people or other places. It might be where you're located on the coastline. It might be that you're poor or that you're a woman, or all sorts of other factors that limit your ability to cope with or adapt to climate hazards. And the way I think about it, and this I'll show you that I think IPCC conflates these two things, is that the impact of climate change on a place or on a person depends on two things. It depends on the climate event, how severe is the drought, how high is the sea level rise, how severe is the storm, the physical characteristic of the climate variation, extreme or change, and then secondly, on people's vulnerability or the place's vulnerability. So who's living near the coast? In what type of house? What sorts of resources do they have to cope or adapt? So that's a very simple thing, physical events interacting with actually both social and physical vulnerability that I'll talk about in a minute. And then another simple definition is what I think climate adaptation is how you adjust to climate risks. And you can do it in two ways. You can modify the biophysical system, or you can modify the social system. Well, IPCC's made it much more complicated than that. And it's driven, I think, generations of graduate students sort of crazy trying to figure out how to organize their research around the IPCC definition, because they've decided that vulnerability is a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. They put the sort of the climate risk within the definition of vulnerability rather than it being outside and intersecting. So I think, and they define this differently in every single one of the IPCC reports, so they keep changing the way they define it. Exposure is location and physical risk. Sensitivity they define as how the system is affected. Adaptive capacity is the ability to adjust or respond, not the sort of actual whether people can adjust or respond. So I think just to make a couple of points about the problems that have been created. First of all, I think the IPCC definition confuses the physical risk, the climate change, with the vulnerability by making exposure part of the definition. And secondly, it conflates how much adaptation may have occurred in a place and time with this incredibly vague concept of capacity to adapt. Now, I thought while I was preparing this, you know, I actually think there's a lot of papers out there now. When I first started writing on vulnerability, there were maybe 1 or 2 papers out there. And when you're doing an IPCC report, your responsibility is to assess the literature. And just in the last year, as I've been working on the chapter I'm responsible for on the 1.5 report, I've Googled various terms like community-based adaptation, and I feel like I'm drinking from the fire hose. And I thought, okay, let's look overall at what's going on with climate vulnerability and climate adaptation. And what you can see here is just an explosion since around 2005 in the number of articles that are being written on climate vulnerability, but even more so, the number of articles that are being written on climate adaptation. It's impossible for anybody to assess that many articles, 1,000, more than 1,000 articles coming out each year. And I also know from the attempts I've had to assess maybe 400 of them in one particular area, is that they're very repetitive. A lot of them are review articles that keep saying the same thing. And then there are a lot of case studies, and case studies are wonderful. I do a lot of case studies, but it's very hard to combine them in order to come to some sort of general assessment, such as is needed in the IPCC. So this is an exploding area of research, and somebody said to me, is this talk a paper you're going to actually write about vulnerability? And I wanted to say, no, there are too many papers out there. This is just a sort of synthesis of my thinking. And I'm not going to talk through these diagrams, but this is just a small sample of people's attempts to make sense of the IPCC way of measuring vulnerability. And they draw their spider diagrams, and then they try to plug in insights from other areas, such as the livelihoods approach down here, being linked to climate vulnerability. Here's somebody trying to specify sensitivity, adaptation, and exposure. And my students have really had a hard time with this when they want to actually study vulnerability in a particular place. So we tend to go back to much simpler ways of thinking about it. And one of the simple ways to think about it, this is just from Puerto Rico a few months ago. And you can see here very simply that what you have is an event, the hurricane coming on shore, and then what's affecting the losses are 2 very straightforward things. And the reason I want to mention it is to emphasize that vulnerability is both physical and social, and is intersecting with a physical event. Although if you think of climate change as being socially created, even the hurricane itself might not be viewed as a purely physical event. But what you've got here are people who are living in poorly constructed houses, but they're living on a steep slope, which is the biophysical component of their vulnerability. So if you live on a steep slope, if you farm on a drought-prone soil, you've got a biophysical component to your vulnerability. But then there are all sorts of social components, like your housing type, like your income, like whether you can afford insurance, and so on. So this is the super simple model that I would propose. Back to basics vulnerability. You've got your climate risks intersecting with vulnerability, which is both biophysical, and then I've separated out the individual characteristics of the person, such as gender, race, ethnicity, poverty, with what I would call institutional aspects of vulnerability, which is whether assistance is available, the various sort of forms of social organization that might help people. And then those combine to create climate impacts. You then will have climate adaptation. I don't want to wrap that in with vulnerability. It's too complicated. And you can either change the climate risk itself by reducing the risks of global warming, for example, or you can reduce vulnerability. So that's where I want to go back to. Very, very simple measurement of vulnerability. So in terms of how we measure vulnerability, if you look at the literature, if you look at even half the literature, you'll see some very common themes. So the most common way that people measure vulnerability to climate is poverty, and they usually use GDP per capita. Or some sort of percentage below a threshold income or poverty line. The second set of measures are socioeconomic, and they're things like age, gender, race, educational literacy, physical ability. Less often you will see people including what I think are very important biophysical measures of vulnerability. I've already mentioned, like topography or slope, but also ecological factors that affect individual vulnerability. And then I separate out a set of sort of external to the body of the individual. If you think of the socioeconomic measures as being embodied measures of vulnerability, there are things like the type of house you live in, the type of job you have, and just to sort of break those down, you've got things like land, your housing tenure, whether you've got access to clean water and sanitation. If the agriculture area, you're going to want to look at whether people have irrigation, whether they use inputs. And then the type of employment is important to your vulnerability. And I'll come back to that because that's a really understudied area. And then finally, you've got these aspects of response or adaptation that can make you vulnerable, like whether you've got transport, whether you get warnings, whether you've got insurance. So these are the sort of things that people use. And the one point I'll make here and come back to is, unfortunately, a lot of the ways we measure vulnerability, especially at the scale above the household or the community, are dependent on what we collect in censuses and other regular surveys. So a lot of these variables often are used as proxies for what the sort of real vulnerabilities might be. And so much of our study of vulnerability and the development of vulnerability indices has been driven by data availability rather than real insights into what is making people vulnerable. In terms of my own research, just to sort of give you a sense of where what I'm about to talk about comes from, I've got several areas that I've worked in for a long time and where I have current projects. So what's unusual about this talk is I usually talk about the rest of the world, and in much of this talk I'm actually going to talk about where I live, Tucson, Arizona. And I'll explain why that's such an interesting place to look at vulnerability as it relates to race and gender and other characteristics. But we've also just finished a study on the vulnerability in the California drought, which has not ended, even though people don't talk about it anymore. I've worked for decades in Mexico, in many different parts of Mexico. And then my newer research is in the Caribbean. We've been collaborating with the University of the West Indies, doing a variety of climate studies, both about whether climate information reduces vulnerability or not, and then about climate adaptation, working in the Caribbean, mostly in Jamaica, and then most recently a new collaboration with Guatemala, where there are highly vulnerable populations, both biophysically and socially, and there I'm fortunate to work with a former student of mine, Alex Guerra, who's now the director of a climate institute in Guatemala. And then I'm also spending too much of my time on IPCC and also on the US National Climate Assessment. It's not research, but it's the one thing that forces you to read lots and lots of literature when you're doing an assessment. And so I've put 3 research questions, which are sort of driving me right now. Can climate information, all sorts of information, whether it's a climate forecast or a vulnerability map, can it actually reduce suffering and economic losses? And I am driven by reducing suffering. That's part of what got me interested in this and what keeps me going. The second is what adaptation strategies could help. And then one of the things that's come up because of what we're working on with the IPCC is the new challenge of, can we reduce the risk of climate change and meet the Sustainable Development Goals, which basically means can we eliminate poverty and hunger and reduce the risk of climate change, which is perhaps the biggest challenge we've faced. The theoretical framework I use comes from a lot of geographers and anthropologists. I work from political ecology, and I define it as the interaction of structures and institutions, individual behavior and agency, and nature, which means we go out and we do collect physical data as well as finding out about institutions and about individual lives. And so when I design a study, I'll include all of these in the study, looking at how political economy has shaped the human-environment relations, how it constrains individual choice. I'll look at individual characteristics and perceptions, and I'll look at how natural resources and environment, what their condition is and how they change. And I and my students use a lot of mixed methods, and we work across scales from the individual person through the household, all the way up to national level assessments. So I want to ask an interesting question that I don't have the answer to yet, and I think it's something that we all need to think about. So if we mostly define vulnerability as using poverty as a measure, and we say, okay, the poor are more vulnerable to climate change, do the big reductions in poverty that we're seeing worldwide and in particular countries, have they actually made people less vulnerable, and have they reduced climate impacts? And there's surprisingly few studies that have actually, a lot of people are characterizing poverty and linking it to vulnerability, but they're not looking at changes in poverty and how they relate to vulnerability. And at the global level, of course, we have the relative success that was declared around the Millennium Development Goals, which were the UN goals to improve lives between 1990 and 2015. The goals were actually set in 2020, which was a bit of a cheat. They knew they'd done pretty well from the 1990 baseline. And there's a whole bunch of goals here, many of which you can relate to conditions of vulnerability to climate and and climate extremes. But if we look at the most interesting one, this is what's happened in terms of the cutting the number of people in extreme poverty by half. And often when I ask students about this, they think it would have gone in the other direction. Whereas in fact, if you accept the measure of poverty used in the MDGs, we actually did cut poverty over that 20-year period, and in fact, we exceeded the 2015 goal for cutting poverty. So that's where this question comes to me from. If we halved poverty and we define vulnerability in terms of poverty, have we actually reduced vulnerability? And there's one study that I'll mention. There are a couple that have done this, but this is perhaps one of the most interesting, done by my colleagues, and particularly Maria Lemos, who is absolutely brilliant, and you should have her come and talk, but I'm proud because at one point she was my postdoc a very long time ago. She's now one of the best people in our field. And she did something very interesting, which was in '98, she and I wrote a proposal to NOAA to try and understand drought vulnerability in northeast Brazil. I then drifted off and did lots of other stuff, but she stuck with it. And it's very hard to get funding for these longitudinal studies, but together with Don Nelson and others, they've been able to go back. So this recent paper in Global Environmental Change, they looked at how drought vulnerability had changed between '98 and 2012 in Ceará, the poorest area of Brazil. And they have 476 farm households that they tracked. And what was very interesting is Brazil, of course, is an emerging economy. Poverty has declined dramatically in Brazil over that period. And there are even specific policies that are targeted at reducing vulnerability that they were able to look at. They looked at the Bolsa Familiar, which is a cash transfer payment program, as long as you get your kids vaccinated and send them to school. And then they also introduced rural pensions for people over 65. At the same time, there was some investments in climate adaptation. So some people were able to put in material reductions of vulnerability like irrigation or buy insurance. And they studied these households, and they found they have some interesting results. I'll just mention a couple. One is that the biggest increase in food security related to climate variations was from the pensions. Irrigation and insurance were important, but the basic impact, the basic income payment, the cash transfer, had no effect whatsoever. That was the one that was actually boosting up people's incomes, and because it wasn't linked to what people should invest in. So they found that rather than use that to increase food security by investing in agriculture or by food purchases, people were using it to pay for their kids' education. They were thinking about reducing the vulnerability of the next generation, for example, or they were buying a motorbike or other consumption items. So this is just one example of somebody's attempt to actually look at this question of if we reduce poverty, what happens to vulnerability? And I'd like to see a lot more of these sorts of studies. And I've been encouraging some of my students to look for studies that were done a long time ago. So I actually am excited now because I have a PhD student who's in Oaxaca trying to find the same plots, a lot of the people aren't there, that my master's advisor, Anne White, worked on in 1973, so that we can try to look at how things have changed in Oaxaca in terms of vulnerability. And then now, of course, we're looking forward to the next development goals, which seek to eliminate poverty, eliminate hunger. We could spend an hour talking about the problems with the Sustainable Development Goals, but we have no poverty, we have no hunger, and we now have a goal specifically, this is not pointing very well, goal 13 on climate action. And this is one of the goals of the current IPCC report, the chapter I'm working on, is to actually look at the trade-offs and synergies between the SDGs and climate action. And this is the author group. And again, an aside, the really important thing about this author group is not how brilliant they are, but it's 38% women. The first IPCC report only had 2 women that were involved. So we've improved our gender balance here in authorship. And in fact, we wrote a paper a few weeks ago about gender in the IPCC, because women scientists can be vulnerable to not having their voice heard. But we're spending a lot of time trying to look at this question, and the problem we're having as an IPCC report is assessing a literature that doesn't exist. There's a handful of papers that link the SDGs with climate issues. So now let me switch to some of the work that we're doing on understanding climate vulnerability in Tucson, particularly in relation to people's various identities. And you may think it's always 115 in Tucson. It's never 115 in Tucson. This is last year when we got all-time high temperatures. And if you're from southern Arizona, the way you sort of talk about this is you say, oh my gosh, we're turning into Phoenix, which people in Tucson look at Phoenix in a very negative way. But then people in Phoenix say, oh, we're turning into Yuma. That's the sort of joking version. But when you get temperatures of 115, these sort of heat wave temperatures, that creates problems for everybody, but especially for particular populations. And we need to combine this increase in the number of very, very hot days with what's happening with the snowpack and with river flow on the Colorado River, because half our water in Tucson is pumped from the Colorado River. And the latest papers suggest that we're looking at least a 40% reduction in flows of the Colorado. So we may be losing water. And of course, when there's less water, the price goes up. So that's another sort of interaction with income and deprivation. So some of the studies that we're doing, these are all across the university. I've involved in some of them. So we've got people working at what's happening to local climate, the physical measures. We've got some really interesting projects where our colleagues in remote sensing are working with social scientists to try to understand what's happening to patterns of heat in the city and to, for example, mosquito breeding sites. We've been looking at how the media is covering the changing climate in the Southwest. We've been doing surveys and focus groups with different populations, both agricultural workers, indigenous groups, people in the city. We have interviews with the social service and other agencies, and we have household level interviews. We've been doing some participatory mapping, and then it's really important that we live in Tucson, and so a lot of what we're doing is observation and experience of living in a place that has a changing climate. Oh, and before I go to the next slide, it's important to note that Tucson's a really important place to look at vulnerability. We're the 8th poorest metropolitan area in the US. Arizona is one of the poorest states in the US. I'll give you some other data about particular groups, but we're also a hotspot for climate change. The climate's already changed by 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit in Tucson, and we're warmer and drier than much of the rest of the US. So it's not just that we live there, we're actually a hotspot both socioeconomically and physically for trying to understand what's happening with climate change. So rather than a priori, in most of our studies, rather than a priori say, we know poverty is what's making people vulnerable, in this particular study of vulnerability in Tucson, we went to focus groups. We went to the people who live in different parts of Tucson, and we asked them, we used triangulation, where we asked them more about what they thought made their friends and neighbors vulnerable rather than themselves, because there's a lot of research that shows that you get better data from asking people about other people than you do about asking them about themselves. And I could talk more about that methodology, but basically these are the things that came up when people talked about, and we didn't really talk about climate change, we talked about heat waves and we talked about droughts, because those are the ways people are experiencing climate change. So they talked about food security, but the main thing they talked about wasn't what was happening to agriculture somewhere in Arizona, it was what was happening to the food prices in the supermarkets. And even when there were price increases that were because of other reasons, they linked it to drought and to climate change. A lot of people tried to have gardens in Tucson, and climate's threatening those. And then they talked about changes in food assistance that aren't climate related, they're more related to changes in public policy. Water, of course, a massive issue in the American Southwest. Whether it's access to water, but the biggest issue, of course, for people is the cost of water. And this is where personal observation comes in. I mean, I'm a well-off Tucsonan, but I have to pour myself a gin and tonic before I look at my water bill in the summer, because it's often been over $300 a month. And that's true for poor people as well. Water quality is a problem relating to climate. Energy costs are enormous in the Southwest. I mean, this is coming to you guys as climate changes, but it's pretty hard to survive in Tucson without air conditioning in the summer. Though some people have coolers, but the air conditioning bill can easily be $300 a month as well if your house is not well insulated. There's also energy costs in cooling your house through shade and insulation. I'll show you that in a minute. Health status, big problem. The elderly, the children, the disabled were all identified by the focus groups as vulnerable. And then this was an interesting finding that is not common in the literature, though there are a few very good studies, was the role of employment. And this, as I'll show you, is the one where the sort of general assumption that women are more vulnerable than men flips around, because it's the men that are working in the employment sector, mostly men working in the employment sectors, which are vulnerable, which is why we need to talk about gender and climate change, not women and climate change, because it's gender differences. And then in the highly mixed city of Tucson, ethnicity, race, and gender are all important, and I'll show you in intersectional ways. And immigration status is important. A lot of people are not seeking help because of the current politics around immigration. Oh, this just shows you our climate is warming. These are some of the projections for the Southwest. I don't know what it's looking like in New England, but if we stay on the post-Paris trajectory without doing anything more to reduce emissions, the Southwest is heading for 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming by the end of the century, which actually takes crops and people into levels of heat stress that are almost not survivable under some conditions. So this is just one of the studies that we're looking at in terms of vulnerability, and this is one that's to do at least directly with biophysical vulnerability. This is a study done in my department, which is looking at vegetation cover and its relationship to socioeconomic characteristics. And so this is a map of where the vegetation is in Tucson. You can see a couple of parks here. And the importance here is that vegetation cools the climate. It's much cooler if you live in a more vegetated area. And I'm privileged because I live actually right here, which is near one of the greenest parts of Tucson. And interestingly, my neighborhood association has me speaking out now about the proposal to develop this golf course here, asking me to talk about what it would mean in terms of temperatures in our neighborhood. But the point here is that this area is South Tucson, which is the poorest, mostly Latino area of Tucson, and the vegetation cover is much lower. And then if you do a thermal heat mapping of Tucson, you start to see that, especially in the summer, these areas are much, much hotter than the areas that are more vegetated. And just to give you a visual sense, that's not my house, but it's my neighborhood. And this are the sort of what you see in the poorer areas of Tucson. So there's a sort of a clear link between vegetation cover and vulnerability to heat waves. But also, of course, there are deeper drivers here because it actually costs something to maintain that sort of landscaping. The very deep-rooted trees didn't used to need irrigating, but now they do because we're having such long periods without rain and with high temperatures in Tucson. People who live in, who have lower incomes can't afford to pay for the irrigation. So if we look at poverty in Tucson and look at a little bit more behind who is poor in Tucson and therefore who's dealing with high air conditioning, high water costs, and no vegetation, we have a project called the Poverty in Tucson Poverty Project that's run out of our sociology department, but we've been now collaborating with them on what that means for sort of vulnerability in Tucson. Here you can see our high poverty rate, the city of Tucson, and it's increased 8% in the last decade. We're at 26% poverty rate compared to less than 16 for the US as a whole. And then this is the sort of physical map. It's a poverty index of Tucson. There's the park. I'm in an area which is relatively well off. In fact, it's the areas north of the river in the foothills that are really wealthy. But you can see large neighborhoods where the poverty rate is high. And then if you move to what's happening within Tucson, the graphs on the bottom you could look at in detail. But basically, if you're under 18, a female-headed household, Black, American Indian, oh, I'm sorry for the typo, Asian or Hispanic, if you're foreign-born, disabled, or unemployed, the poverty rate is much higher than if you are an Anglo who is abled, who is in a family with perhaps both male and female head, and if you were born in the US. So we have great differences we have great differences amongst different categories in Tucson. But the point I want to make here is that most people are multiple versions of these identities. And, but before I get there, let me just show you the data on what it means if you are poor in Tucson. So this is a utility bill that I got from some friends who are not so well off and live in a not well off part of Tucson. 3-bedroom home, July 2017, a $350 electric bill, $250 water bill, and 40% of the households in Tucson earn under $1,500 a month take home. You can get some relief from the utilities or from your church, but it's very modest. So people now are choosing basically not to cool their house, and that is leading to a lot of problems for the elderly, and people are having a lot of problems with their kids in the summer, because if you're in a house like this, you can't really send them out to play in the yard because it's 115 degrees. So they're inside going stir crazy because you can't afford to turn the thermostat down on the air conditioning. And we had people saying we have people talking to us saying they're having to decide between buying food or air conditioning their house. So these are some quotes from the household interviews and from interviews with various social service agencies. And I won't read through them. You can look at them yourself. There are comments about the electricity costs being a burden for the poor. This is the one about feeding their kids or keeping them cool. There's the they know about this problem of not having tree cover, adding to the heat problem. A very interesting comment about the mosquito habitat because of trash and leaks, particularly in the rental neighborhoods. And then the last one is the one that I think is particularly powerful, and this is not the only quote, that said there's a lot of prejudice that adds to people's problems. If you're Black or Latino, if you don't speak English well, or you're undocumented, you may not seek assistance, you might not get a job, and you end up living in unsafe or unhealthy neighborhoods. And then the next one is a quote. I know it's a long quote, but it epitomizes for me the intersectional or multidimensional vulnerabilities of poor ethnic women in Tucson. So she says, I'm Mexican and Indian, I'm a single mom, and I also look after my aunt and my grandmother. I don't have documents, that means she's undocumented. I didn't finish high school, I work as a house cleaner. I can't afford a house, so we live in a trailer, but the air conditioning's too expensive and the water's bad. I don't ask the government for help, probably because she's undocumented. We go to the community food bank and we get some money. She has land out on the reservation, but the schools there aren't any good, so she stays living in the city center. And then she says, I don't know why there's so much discrimination against us. We, the Indians, were her first, and then it was part of Mexico. I guess it's because we're brown and some people think we're illegal. The worst time for us is the summer. I can't keep the trailer cool and the kids get too hot outside. The monsoon rains flood the trailer park and there are lots of bugs. I think she's talking about mosquitoes. And then this is the kicker, and there's less work because some of my houses close up for the summer and don't need me. The wealthy in Tucson, there's a lot of people who are snowbirds, so they're only there in the winter. But then even many of the academics at the university who are not the wealthiest, they leave for the summer because we're not teaching. And therefore she loses her job because we don't want our houses cleaned. So this brings me to the idea of intersectional vulnerability. It draws on literature in feminism and sociology. It's the interaction between gender, race, and other aspects of difference. And we have a whole set of categories and many more that I think we need to look at when we look at vulnerability, but we need to remember that these are not census categories. These are embodied in particular individuals, like the woman who I just showed you the quote from. Women generally more vulnerable than men for a whole variety of reasons, both in the developed and the developing world, property rights, and we must remember that there are things in the census that we can measure. all right, we might be able to measure pay differential, we might be able to measure property rights, but we don't measure sexism or racism in the census or in most other socioeconomic studies we might do. But as I'll show in a minute, the men's lives can also be vulnerable in particular ways. Indigeneity, Tucson has 3 Indian reservations that intersect with the city, and on those maps they are some of the poorer and most vulnerable areas of Tucson. Race is a problem. Tucson is considered fairly well integrated, but there are deeply racist attitudes and institutions, criminalization of Latinos. And then I wanted to mention caste, because I'm not just talking about Tucson. This intersectionality is something we need to look at across the world. And Pradnir Garud, my student, is now working on caste as a sort of a core of intersectional vulnerability in India. And then, of course, there are questions of citizenship, language status, and your immigrant status. This is a diagram, and this is where, again, I think we're overcomplicating. This is from the IPCC, and it's from the last report, where there is an attempt to bring in these questions of intersectionality, but Petra calls it multidimensional vulnerability. So it does bring together all of these identity categories to suggest that this is an important component of understanding vulnerability, where you go from the privileged to the marginalized, and the more marginalized, the more vulnerable, the more privileged, the more capacity and opportunities you have. I'm going to skip the caste one and talk a little bit more about race, because just in the last year, there's been quite a bit of retrospective on Hurricane Katrina that I think brought home to most people in the US and actually around the world. It's sort of the archetype example of how race and racism makes you more vulnerable to climate change. But one of my students came to me and said, oh, there's this great issue of, I think it's environmental sociology, that has looked at Katrina from the point of intersectional vulnerability, saying we shouldn't have just looked at race. We should have looked at all of the other characteristics of people living in New Orleans that gave them multiple vulnerability and is still a problem for them more than a decade later. So one of the papers is this nice paper by Cadets and Mock, which actually looked at what happened to women during Katrina and subsequently. And this was data I hadn't known, I should have, is that 41% of households in New Orleans were headed by women at the time. A quarter of the poor in, a quarter of all women in New Orleans were poor, which was higher than for men. 61% of the elderly in New Orleans were poor. In Tucson, our elderly are relatively well off as a retirement community. Men were earning 30% more than women. And then in the aftermath, women were twice as likely to have PTSD. But I thought this was particularly interesting that post-Katrina, they found that compared to other businesses and services, public schools, public transport, hospitals, childcare centers, and female occupations all took much longer to recover than other facilities. And these are all gendered occupations or gendered responsibilities. And they show very powerfully that the greatest vulnerability, both before and after Katrina, was not just about race, but was at the intersection of gender, race, occupation, age, and family status. So let me just highlight, go back to this idea that it's about gender, not necessarily about only women, and just talk very briefly about the findings in Tucson or in Arizona about the vulnerability of certain male-dominated occupations. We've identified sort of 6 main categories. Farm workers, I think a lot of people do think about when it's very, very hot, and when we think about people working outside. It's not just the heat you feel from as you harvest, it's that if you're wearing protective clothing, you take it off when it gets too hot. So it's also increasing exposure to pesticides. People working in ranching, but also we have these enormous intensive dairy farms in the West. And I noticed driving through with my niece and nephew, they were like, oh, the poor cows, whereas I was thinking, oh, the poor people working with the cows, because they are really oppressive working conditions. And then I think we think about the fire crews, but we don't necessarily link the risks they're facing. They're mostly male, not always male, linked to climate change. And then in the urban area, you've got people working in the construction sector. In Tucson, we've got a city legislation that says that once it's over 100 degrees, they have to stop working at a certain point. But a lot of people in the construction sector are working informally, and nobody's enforcing that. So you see people working all day, and you get a lot of people turning up with heat stroke, utility maintenance, and then people working in landscaping. All of these are male-dominated occupations, and talking to people at the hospital, there are significant numbers of emergency room visits from people suffering heat stroke. I wanted to make one other point about the importance of studying vulnerability seasonally. So many vulnerability studies are a single snapshot. Someone does a vulnerability study, they do a map, and then they may never go back, or if they do go back, it's 10 years later. Whereas, in fact, vulnerability has tremendous seasonality. So whether you're a farm worker who has no work in the winter and the work's just in the summer, whether you're looking at food prices and how they vary with climate around the world and are high in some seasons and not in others, or in Pradney's case, she's studying the vulnerability of the Dalits in India, the disadvantaged castes. They are vulnerable, but they're also the ones who have to clean the streets during the monsoon and get exposed to all of the waterborne diseases and other problems of walking through particularly diarrheal diseases. So this is a Dalit woman cleaning the street during the monsoon. And there was a great book years ago by Robert Chambers, Seasonal Dimensions to Rural Poverty, and a lot of vulnerability researchers seem to have forgotten about this importance of seasonality. Just a couple more examples of, actually I'm going to skip that one. I did want, I'm going to move to my last point because I'm running out of time. The other thing that we've been looking at is the vulnerability of the food system in Tucson to climate variability and change. And this has become a larger issue for me because I realized in looking at the National Climate Assessment is that when people look at the vulnerability of the food system, they tend to think that the local food system is vulnerable to local climate change and local crop production change. And that is patently not true. Whether it's in the United States or in most parts of the world, we're getting most of our food from outside of our own region. And so the US National Climate Assessment had all these studies of yield changes in the US and said nothing about how climate change would affect agriculture outside the US. The US is one of the world's more self-sufficient countries, but in Arizona, for example, we really get most of our food from outside Arizona. So the important point I want to make here is that we need to start looking more at local vulnerability of food systems in a global context. And it's not just food systems, all of our economic systems. And it's a double. The way in which this manifests is through high prices in grocery stores, which have particular effects on poor people. So we know from 2009, from 2012, that prices were going up because of climate changes in other parts of the world. The second point I'll make is the most vulnerable in the agricultural sector are usually farm workers. And I won't show you the data, But in the study that we've just completed of the California drought, we focused on the farm workers and the communities that they lived in. Thousands of jobs lost, deep deprivation. Most of the communities, the groundwater went down and never came back up. And so people are suffering. So the argument I'll just make here, or the suggestion I'll make here, is that when we look at climate impacts on agriculture, we need to look at vulnerability from beyond places on local places, and we shouldn't forget about the farm workers, because we only found one study of all of those thousands of studies of vulnerability that had looked at how the farm workers were affected by climate as opposed to the farmers or the producers or the big agribusiness companies. Final vulnerability, it's a depressing place to end, is the one other thing that we've been looking at is how what's happening on the border has affected vulnerability to heat waves. And there's already a wall, though the president doesn't know that. And the wall that exists is in the urban areas, and it's forced border crossers to try to cross in the desert. And so some of my colleagues have been working with the NGOs that have been tracking the number of people who are dying crossing the desert. And it's more every year as they cross the hottest part of the desert because they can no longer cross where Border Patrol or the wall is. And they've put together this map. These are all the people who have died. And you can see that they're crossing in the hottest part of the Sonoran Desert. And so what they've been doing is students at University of Arizona have been taking plastic water bottles out into the desert. Somebody was recently arrested, a student from Arizona State, for doing that. We've been making these posters which are put at the border showing people how many people have died. But there's some good things going on, and these are just a few of the reports that we've put together to try to help people deal with being vulnerable in Tucson. Citizens Guide for Readiness in the Desert. This is the Tucson Action Plan, Southwest Climate Assessment. This is the Poverty Workshop reporting to the mayor. And this is my favorite one. We've got a project in 20 of the poorest schools in Tucson for school gardens. But in the process of putting in the school gardens, we work with the students to understand climate change and to understand how gardens and vegetation and conserving water can help them survive in a future climate. So this is the one that makes me feel most optimistic. Thank you very much. I'll have to remember not to talk about Tucson because I just keep talking because I live there.
Great, Diana, thank you so much. So what we're going to do is start a discussion. I've only got about 20 or 30 questions to ask, but we'll just start a discussion and then open this up for a broader Q&A. So let me just start. So this has been absolutely fascinating in trying to understand all the factors that sort of, in a sense, sort of create vulnerability. And thank you for deconstructing vulnerability, because that was a really horrible slide you showed of all those spaghetti diagrams. But I want to ask you about, okay, so now what do we do about it? All right, so the other side of this coin. And one of the things that it also seems to me that, for example, IPCC has wrestled with is this difference of adaptation as a response. We have a flood. We have a northeaster. We move houses back. We put in flood barriers, and adaptation as anticipation.
Yeah.
And so one question is this a distinction without a real difference, or are there different processes involved?
Well, in some ways they're not different if you think about longer-term anticipation and longer-term recovery, because they can both be adaptation, except when you're anticipating adaptation, you're not sure you're doing the right thing. Whereas after the disaster, you've seen what happened, and you should theoretically be able to come in and fix what went wrong. But what usually happens is that we focus on coping and disaster relief, and there's now increasing numbers of examples where what we do for disaster relief actually might be maladaptation in the longer term. The other question, when you say what do you do about it, I mean, you know, we could eliminate poverty and racism and walls, and, you know, that seems a little bit trite, but actually that is that question we're trying to wrestle with about the Sustainable Development Goals, because the Sustainable Development Goals are supposed to be much larger. They're supposed to be about equality for all across a wide range of conditions. And I think the interesting question for climate researchers is, what is it about achieving the various SDGs that either increases or reduces vulnerability to climate change, increases or reduces adaptation? And perhaps the biggest clash is actually about mitigation, because if you look at the Millennium Development Goals, we succeeded on many of them, but the one we didn't succeed on was carbon dioxide emissions. They went up tremendously during that period, and it was partly because millions, hundreds of millions of people came out of poverty in China and India, and their emissions went up. So perhaps it's not vulnerability and adaptation that's the problem with the SDGs, it's the emissions. How can we you know, get energy for all and food for all without continuing to threaten people with climate change? But we are looking for case studies, and there are a few people starting to write now about, and what's interesting actually is some countries are taking this on. So in the, you know, the US, I don't think pays any attention to the SDGs, a little bit on climate. But if you go to some of the islands in the Caribbean, small islands, it's the same people who are tasked with coping with climate change as with meeting the SDGs. And they're actually designing development policy around achieving both of them. And that's really interesting, except many of those islands in the Caribbean talk about dependency on food and climate elsewhere. They are getting so much that's imported for elsewhere that they can't fix the SDGs or climate without the world doing something about it.
And does that give us some insight into the sort of thinking about adaptation measures, or a combination of a variety of response measures? Does that tell us something interesting about this balance between sort of individual responses and institutional responses? I mean, you brought it up and didn't talk very much about it.
Right. Well, in terms of the balance of individual versus institutional, individuals can only do so much. And another thing we've been talking about coming out of sort of critical social theory in my grad seminar is this sort of responsibilization, where we make everybody feel that they're individually responsible for climate change or reducing emissions, whereas there are studies showing that we're so limited in our choices by various institutional structures or what's available in terms of consumer products, that the individual can only do so much. And so one of the students in my class said, after reading all these articles on how we're trying to push all the responsibility on individuals to adapt or to mitigate, and in fact they can only do a little bit, she said, well, actually, probably we should just be telling people to vote, because it's the political institutions that are getting in the way of us responding to climate change and limiting our choices, whether it's, you know, whether we can have solar in Arizona or not. So there's a tension between the individual response and the institutional response, and I think we sometimes spend too much time on the individual. I mean, I really want those kids to change the institutions that force them into poverty, not have to do it all themselves.
Okay. Let me open this up. So let me just ask people two things, and one is to wait for the mic because we are live streaming this, and secondly, to just identify yourself when you ask a question.
Great, thank you. I'm Julie Klinger. I'm a professor at the Pardee School and also the Associate Director of the Land Use and Livelihoods Initiative at the Global Development Policy Center. And I loved your talk and the way that you were unpacking this really taken for granted notion that you think of poverty alleviation as a solution to climate change, right? And I think it's really useful how you're unpacking that. But I want to go back to your observation that vulnerabilities are not census categories, that they're embodied. And I think with the contemporary debate around what questions to include on the U.S. Census, for example, your deliberations on this question or conundrum, I think, are especially timely, right? Because in order to mobilize public resources to combat structural inequalities, they have to be named and quantified. But of course, in racist and sexist institutional contexts, naming and quantifying certain vulnerabilities generates a lot of peril for specific people. So how do we navigate that?
Oh, don't know if I have an answer for that. I mean, I don't think we can get questions on the census that are going to answer that. So perhaps, well, one of the ways in the Tucson Poverty Project that my colleagues in sociology are trying to deal with it is by very closely trying to link what they're learning in the household surveys, which is richer and more qualitative, to what they can see in the census data. But that's still not going to capture, and it's more that because of privacy concerns, you don't know what an individual census response is. So if you could actually see someone's census, you could see, oh yeah, they're African American and they're female and they're disabled and they're a veteran. But we can't see those census results because of privacy, which is good. But on the other hand, it doesn't allow you to see those intersectional vulnerabilities except at some statistically aggregated way. So I mean, it's been interesting with the Poverty Project because it's undergraduates who are doing the household interviews, and they are shocked that most of our undergraduates are fairly well off and they're going into the poorer areas, and they get really, really sad and upset about what they find out about how poor people are in Tucson. Even our interns in the school gardens, it changes them. And I do think I mean, they also come back saying, oh, I feel like I really wasted someone's time or invaded their privacy. And so we have a lot of ethical discussions. But actually having them go in and talk to people about their lives gives them insights. I don't know how we use the insights of those individual students to change attitudes more broadly. But it's a really hard question. I don't know. What do you think?
Over here, yeah. It's coming right around.
Okay. Hi, my name is Clarabel Santiago. So the energy companies actually go to folks that are living in these conditions, and that's how they get their ideas. So where's the connection for training folks to take the initiative and market how they're living? So the energy companies and people that have money to come in and bring in more economic value to the area.
I don't know whether that's happening in terms of people sharing their skills and strategies with the energy companies, but it is happening in Tucson in terms of people sharing how to live in a hot, dry environment with each other. So in the school garden program, we have Tohono O'odham farmers coming in to share their techniques for farming in a dry environment. We have people teaching people how to make adobe, to change their architecture. So I would say that people are learning from each other, but our energy company is not learning from local people. They're learning from their shareholders and the Koch brothers and people who are funding them. So it's hard to get some of the I would say the city is willing to learn a lot from neighborhood strategies and sharing like water harvesting strategies. There's a big green infrastructure project which is about neighbors helping each other. But there are some things that these institutional factors that it's really hard to change. I mean, solar, for example, I'm a big believer in household solar, but the poor and the deprived cannot afford to put solar on their house. So we've got to work at an institutional political level to get it changed at the utility level, because it costs so much still to put solar on your house. It's made a massive difference to my air conditioning bill. It's gone from $350 to $40 in a summer month, but that was at a $15,000 upfront cost after I'd taken a really nice tax break from the federal government and the state. Well, you can't do that if you're low income. You can't get access to that sort of adaptation. And that's where I think you can't make it all about the individual. You've got to change the larger institutions.
Hi, I'm Suchi Gopal, professor in Earth and Environment.
Did you wait, or do you have a mic?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I had a question about migrations. I met Dr. Eileen O'Keefe this morning, and I've worked with Susie Foster, both from Sargent School. The question is, there seems to be a lot of migration happening as a result of climate change. Some of it is also intertwined with economic forces of development, especially China's expansion into Southeast Asia. In Cambodia, what we sort of became aware of is the fact that people are on the move. A lot of women are moving to work in factories. A lot of children are being, traded off and sold into the mining companies. And there's also a lot of human trafficking and mass migration, implications that were not thought about in a very thoughtful way by the governments, or maybe they're ignoring it. That seems to happen. And what do you think is the future in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of these huge implications coming from international migrations? And we see this happening in Syria, for example.
So that's a very interesting question, because I think from a research point of view, the speculation about climate causes of migration has gotten ahead of the scholarship. And I was talking to Tony this morning about a great paper I just read by Selby et al., which takes apart what happened in Syria and basically absolutely convinced me in a research sense that drought had hardly anything to do with conflict and migration in Syria. So I recommend that paper for a careful take apart of other research papers written by physical scientists who didn't really understand the deep history or the socioeconomics. That's not to say that drought will never cause war or never cause migration, but a lot of the work, I think, has not been done very rigorously. And I've had the experience, written a lot of papers about climate impacts on agriculture in Mexico and Chiapas and Oaxaca, and I found people citing the papers I'd written about problems with food security and agriculture. They actually said that I said it caused migration. I have never said that. And in fact, I've written several papers showing that a drought didn't cause migration from Mexico to the US. And I was in a meeting just recently with some people from the State Department who were talking about drought causing migration from Mexico to the US right now, and that this Guatemalan thing was all to do with climate. And I'm like, well, no, first of all, there isn't a drought or a natural disaster. It's a human disaster that's happening in Guatemala and Honduras. And secondly, migrations at, what is it, the 40-year low or something from Mexico into the United States. So there's a lot of correlation without good causation. And then the other thing I would say, you've got me on one of my things I rant about here, is that the research is so poorly designed, whether it's looking at whether climate causes migration or whether climate causes war. People flip around the X and Y. They go look at where migration or war is happening, and they look for the climate explanation. What we should be doing is looking at all the places where we've got climate crises and looking at whether there's migration or not, or whether there's war or not. And I think if we did that, we'd find a lot of places where maybe migration isn't happening and we'd understand why, which would help us adapt. So whilst I think the possibility is there, I think the research is pretty controversial at this point about what the links are likely to be. And the final thing I'd say is migration's always been a response to climate change for thousands of years. It's an adaptation. It's not an awful thing. And one of my favorite movie scenes is from, what was that, The Day After Tomorrow, where the US has to ask to migrate into Mexico. That's what, I like that one.
Yeah, over here.
Hi. So I'm actually a current student here in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm going to be studying environmental justice and looking over some climate mitigation plans for my research my senior year. So I just had a question, because it seems that, I mean, this is like a recurring theme, is that we need to have more localized plans to really address these kinds of communities that are so vulnerable. However, these are communities that are also have a very deep distrust towards institutions. And I was just curious, in your opinion, like how to combat that distrust, to get their input to make better plans.
So I think I would say it depends what sort of community you're talking about. I mean, the work we're doing in Tucson, it actually helps that we are in Tucson, and it actually helps that a lot of families would really like their kids to go to the University of Arizona and support our sports teams, the families do. And so when a U of A student goes to talk to someone, people will talk to them. You know, it's actually been easier than I thought, because there's a community identity. It's different if you're going to work in a different part of the world. And we have a lot of discussions, for example, about working with the tribal nations in Arizona, because a lot of people, some students have a sort of romantic image of, oh, I'm going to go help the Navajo or the Hopi, and that leads to a lot of problems. But the way we've dealt with that is to hire Native American faculty who help sensitize or introduce, and also to recruit as many Native American students as we can to work on our climate projects. So there's a lot of challenges in how you approach people. But in general, in studying vulnerability in the US, I would probably partner with trusted community organizations. So in Tucson, one of the most sort of constructive collaborations around social justice is with the community food bank. And the way I've had students do that is, I say, you go volunteer there for a while before you ask them to help you, so you can sort of give back at the same time. And we have a lot of questions about what you should give back. And the School Gardens Project's a really nice way to give back, help the schools in the community where you're working. But it's a massive discussion about how to do that, but good luck.
Oh, John, right here.
I'm not a student here. I do have a degree from BU, but I'm a full-time climate justice activist at this point. And I was really struck by your question about, can we meet sustainable development? I saw those as justice goals without exacerbating climate change. And I want you to talk a little bit more about that. You know, we look at Puerto Rico now, it seems to me there's a real opportunity to kind of leapfrog and create a new energy system. Elon Musk has offered to help, et cetera. Is it possible in India and China to, you know, not use fossil fuels and lift people out of poverty? I also have one other sort of thought I'd like you to talk about, which is the whole idea of sustainability. Doesn't that mean kind of living in more harmony with a finite set of resources?
Well, I think this is one of the big debates, is whether we meet the Sustainable Development Goals by lowering consumption and having everybody drop to a lower level of consumption, a less environmentally significant level of consumption, or whether we use technology and innovation to try to find ways to bring people out of poverty with less environmental impact. To me, that's a really big challenge, is can we innovate our way to the Sustainable Development Goals rather than have it all be about, maybe you can't come out of poverty because it's going to have environmental impact, or maybe you can't, you're going to have to stop flying because of your environmental impact. And I haven't seen that. I've seen that solution work in very particular cases, but I don't see it as a global solution yet. So the problem with the Sustainable Development Goals is there are so many of them, and there are so many targets, and they contradict each other, that I don't know how people are going to manage our way to the future with the Sustainable Development Goals. It was easier with the Millennium Development Goals. I think what happened is everybody got what they wanted put into those goals, and nobody made the hard choices that we need to make about, well, if there was one of them we were going to meet that would then help solve all the others, what would that be? So for social justice, it's probably the poverty one. But for environment, which one would you pick? Would it be the climate goal, the ecosystem goal? Because there are trade-offs. In meeting one, you risk not being able to meet the others. Now, your other question, which I can't remember, was about, there was the SDGs, and then, about what living sustainably meant. Well, to be honest, the word sustainable is worse than the word vulnerable in terms of everybody defining it however they want to meet it. And the irony is, I've just finished a paper for a geography journal on the Sustainable Development Goals, is almost every goal mentions we will have sustainable cities, we will have sustainable agriculture, we will have sustainable X, and resilient, sustainable and resilient, and nowhere are those terms defined. It's actually pretty stunning that anybody let them get away with putting a completely undefined word in almost every one of the goals. And some people are even debating, well, what does gender equality mean? What does equality mean? Because there are different, definitions of what equality would be. But the real irony is defining sustainable development as doing things sustainably. That's not a very clear guide.
Other questions? Here and then in the back.
Hi, my name is Robin Clemens. I'm a concerned citizen about environmental issues. My question is, you already touched on it briefly, about our government and that there's so many climate change deniers. And now we have Scott Pruitt basically gutting the EPA. How can activists and concerned people fight back against the blatant ignorance and stupidity of people that are in charge now and basically in denial of climate change? And how can we hold them accountable and hopefully eventually get rid of them so that we can, wake people up that this is really an issue and happening?
Well, I'm about to go to a meeting in Botswana, and a lot of my colleagues from around the world who care about climate change are going to ask us, what's going on in the US and what's happening, and how are you coping with not a strong climate signal from your federal government? And I will say two things. One is, look at all the other levels of governance, and there is quite a lot happening. So I talk about what's happening in California and the importance of the California economy to the overall US economy. You're in a state that takes a lot of action. Unfortunately, I'm not. The state of Arizona is not very strong on climate policy. But look at all the non-nation state actors, whether it's the cities, the states, and the businesses that are doing the right thing. And then the second thing I tell them is we've got an election coming in November, and we can work in a non-bipartisan way if you want, because we've got, I happen to have two senators who are Republicans who actually speak out quite a bit on environment, but we can work to change things, and you change them, everything from your city to your school board to your state to the federal. So, and the interesting thing, I don't know if it's happening at BU, but I have 4 colleagues at University of Arizona who are running for the state, either state legislature or school board or the corporation commission, which is the most important one because it determines renewable energy policy. And I think they're nuts because I've got one friend in the legislature right now, and it's really, really hard work. They're sacrificing themselves. But a lot of people are deciding to run for office rather than just complain.
So I'll just interject for a second. So one of the things, I don't know if we've seen that phenomenon at BU. Other people might know better.
Still time to sign up, Tony.
I live in New Hampshire. Our state motto is live free or die. It really doesn't leave a lot of room for negotiation. But what we have seen on the campus is a really quite dramatic turnaround really in sort of the attitude of the institution about climate change, about emissions, about building resilience, in a way that I think could not necessarily have been anticipated even 3 or 4 years ago. And it's really been, approved by our climate action plan, is approved by our board of trustees, and has real tangible actions embedded in it.
Yes, so
I
that's
think
we're
seeing it differently.
Change the institution you work for. I mean, and students can definitely do that. They've done a lot at the University of Arizona. I was telling somebody at lunch that our undergraduates organized, and they were a public institution. They got a fee passed for sustainability, so students pay $25 a semester on their tuition, and it goes into a fund that is partly managed by students to invest in sustainability on campus and in projects. They even fund course development by faculty. So faculty are going to the students to grovel for course development money. But it's amazing because it's more than $1 million a semester. And I'll tell the joke too, is it had to go through our Board of Regents, which manages the university, and they're fairly conservative. They're not particularly green. And we thought the students called it the green fee, and we thought it passed because they thought it was something for golf.
There are worse reasons.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for your, I am a concerned citizen also that happens to have a degree in environmental sciences. It just occurred to me with the last question and your answers, especially as you as educators, it looks like that is a fight between the old and the new. We have new issues based on old teachings. So I think that as educators, you need to create new subjects, that you are empowering the new students with new ideas and new visions, how to solve all these problems, because our houses are not adapted to the new issues that we are having. And some of us don't even understand what's happening because we don't have enough understanding. So maybe we should start at the very base, which is education. And the way you started with the schools before we get to the university. So if the kids learn, they teach their parents, and then they become better green citizens. And basically creating new subjects.
Yeah, I think.
And new disciplines, because I see it as a fight between the old and the new.
Yeah, I think you have a very good point. The one thing, though, that I became aware of a few years ago, and it's part of the reason I put this slide in at the end after the awful slides about the migrant deaths in the desert, is I teach an intro environmental class, and I think it was called environmental conservation, and I heard that the students called it environmental depression, because all I did was talk about awful things. And I realized that I was making them almost, so depressed and with so little hope. And so I actually then started changing so that I would use more success stories. And then I did a course on getting women to write op-eds. And I wrote an op-ed on it, and it got into the Washington Post. And then I got all of these people, faculty, writing to me saying, oh, you're so right. What are your good news case studies? I need them. So that when we can teach how bad things are, but we can also teach realistic solutions that aren't just shower less and turn the thermostat down, but have more global implications. But so we should teach more about it, but we should also make sure we have some positive things that we teach.
So I think we've got time for one or two more, and then we'll break for the reception. John?
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the talk, Diana. I'm John Connors. I'm a postdoc at the Pardee Center. And I thought this was really intriguing. I love the way you simplified vulnerability, particularly as what I thought in some ways by bringing this idea of intersectionality in, is it really achieved much of what the capabilities approach has sought to do, but in, again, a simplified way. And what I appreciate about it, though, is also, I think, the challenge of it, is that bringing this idea of intersectionality, you're pushing back against categories in essentialism, but much of the bureaucracy and then the project of modernity more generally is about creating these categories and using those to understand and explain the world. So by pulling apart these categories, looking at them in an intersectional way, you're making these problems much messier. So but that's perhaps the nature of them. So how do you go into a room with people who are really, with bureaucrats, people who are in the business of making issues legible, and go in and say to them, actually, this is a really messy problem that can't necessarily be understood through our traditional categories. How do we advance that idea of messiness and sort of working with it and through it?
Well, I haven't thought about it, but as you were asking me, I thought, well, I could go in with a spaghetti diagram, or I could go in with a quote from that woman who started by saying, I'm Mexican and Indian. And I mean, that quote, especially if I could video her talking about it, where she was, I think that might have more of an impact than a spaghetti diagram or census data, because there's something about giving voices to people. But I think the challenge then would be to try to find a research way to then take her and magnify her voice through some sort of larger statistical study, because they could say, oh, that's just one voice. But one of the things I don't know how to do it, but one of the things that I really like is the increasing number of my students who, when they're in the field, are using just their iPhones to video the voices rather than write them down. And I just went to a PhD defense where we didn't have a paper version, it was a web version, and we would click, and rather than having the quote, there would be the video of the person within the dissertation. And it may be the first dissertation that ever made me cry because of one of the quotes was so powerful, but it was because it was the person themselves. So that's one answer, but I don't know quite how else I would do it at this point.
Great. So what I'm going to suggest is that we break. We should have there's a reception set out outside. I know that there are more questions that people have, but let's enjoy it outside. Diana, thank you so much.